I have a couple of remarks, and I'm going to introduce our featured speaker. Let me tell you first a little bit about the Ocean State Prevention Alliance. We're a group of prevention and mental health professionals committed to reducing the negative impact that marijuana is having in Rhode Island communities, especially among our youth. We want to reduce access to marijuana for youth and increase its perception of harm. Over the past several years, we have seen that perception of harm decline. And that's one of our biggest concerns. The marijuana of today is not what was smoked in 1969 in Woodstock. The THC, which is the chemical component that is responsible for marijuana's psychological effects, in 1969 was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 to 4% possibly. What we're seeing now in the state of Rhode Island is a THC closer to probably somewhere around 12 to 15%. And with the onset of butane hash oil, it can get as high as 90 to 98%. And that's a big concern to us. And as was previously stated by some of the other speakers, Rhode Island already tops the chart in marijuana use by 12 to 25-year-olds. And it just really sickens me that Rhode Island once again is on the wrong end of this list. We want our children to be globally competitive, and the use of marijuana puts that in jeopardy. I could talk about how marijuana has proven to lower IQ rates, or about the societal costs of the illicit drug use, which is $181 billion a year in this country, or how in states that have legalized this drug driving has increased, school expulsions have increased, and suspensions have increased. And the black market remains intact and thriving. But I'm going to let our speakers and our panel discuss this a little bit further. Right now, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Hunt, and I'm going to need to tell you a little bit about him. Oh boy, and of course, that's what I'm missing here. Am I missing this piece? I am missing this piece. So I'm going to have Dr. Hunt introduce himself and come up and tell you all about him.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Hunt, and I am a child psychiatrist at Bradley Hospital and the director of inpatient and intensive services in that hospital, and also director of training for child psychiatry and a combined program in pediatrics and psychiatry and child psychiatry at Brown. And happy to be here. It's, I think, a testament to the communities that we're trying to sort this out. At Bradley Hospital, I can say that cannabis use in our patients who've been admitted is about 40% of the patients who have been admitted for various reasons are there because are there in addition to marijuana use, but for depression and other things. And one of the other I think I mentioned this at another meeting. One of the things that has struck me in terms of this issue is that cannabis use by teens is a uncertain proposition when you smoke it. And I'll give you a story of a kid that we admitted a few months ago who was a stellar soccer player, who straight A student, won they lost their game at the end of the season, and he was quite distressed. So that night he embarked on smoking 4 or 5 hits of marijuana, and in that context he became extremely agitated and perplexed and confused, and had a difficult time coping the next day in school, and he continued to get worse. This was the first time he had smoked, and ultimately was admitted to Hasbro, where he attempted to try to jump out the window in his agitated state. He was admitted to our hospital, where he informed us that he smoked something called sour diesel, which was a very potent form of cannabis. And then the challenging part of this was that he didn't recover within a few days. It took him 10 months to recover. And so that part, I think, is something that kids don't often think about. It isn't a common scenario, but it is something that we need to pay attention to. So the other thing is that when you look at the effect of cannabis use early on, the more you use, the more impact it has. There's a study from New Zealand that has shown that with increased use of cannabis between the ages of 14 to 21, they have lower levels of degree attainment by the age of 25, lower income at the age of 25, higher levels of government assistance, higher unemployment, lower levels of relationship satisfaction, and lower levels of life satisfaction. And this was accounting for lots of other variables. So the three things I want to just talk about briefly, and then we can have some questions, is the issue of perception of risk and use. I think it is pretty clear that the more the community at large views the substance cannabis as okay, the more that kids might try it. And that's what's been shown over the last 20 to 25 years. I think the greatest use of cannabis was in the 70s. So when I graduated from high school in 1975, Gerald Ford was president. Nixon had just been impeached and removed from office. And the drinking age where I grew up in Montana was 18. And that was those few years was when the highest rate of marijuana was used, and it also was a time when the perception was the lowest. It's starting to reach those levels again in terms of perception of risk, that the youth of today are seeing that it's okay to smoke, and they're trying it at greater rates than other years. And one of the things that is probably most concerning is the fact that younger and younger adolescents are using it. That there's been in the country, there's been an increased use over the last 2 years in 10th grade use, significantly so from previous years. In some states, much greater than others, including Rhode Island. So the question is that I think we're here for is, and that I'm concerned about, is will legalization, if it goes through, create even a greater risk for the youth because they'll see that the perception of risk is low and they'll try to use it. And in Europe, there's been some studies that have shown that depending on the community, the persistence of cannabis use is highly correlated with the level of acceptance in that given country. In a recent study also, 10% of non-cannabis using high school seniors reported the intention of initiating use if cannabis was legally available. So that's a prospective sense of whether the student would or wouldn't use, but their opinion at the time was that they would give it a try. So I think in states like Colorado and Washington, where it is legal now, there's been a lot of discussion about rates of use going up or down, and I think it's still too early to know what direction those are going to go into. It does look like that in the past year that there's been an increase in use in Colorado in 12 to 17-year-olds, but it's not significantly so. But it is higher than what's considered in what's happening nationally. Nationally, interestingly, there's been a decrease in the amount of past month use by youth age 12 to 17, but it's increasing in Colorado, Washington, and is highest in Rhode Island, which is concerning. And I think we already heard about the graph that has come out in terms of the SAMHSA surveys, where they look at each state use in the past month for use by 12 to 17-year-olds. And again, Rhode Island is at the top, Vermont is second, then the two states that just passed the legalization bills are third and fourth. So why is that an issue? I think no one who is promoting legalization is wanting kids to use it. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that will they attempt to will they at more frequent rates try to use it and use it at with greater frequency. And one of the things that is important to know about the brain is that there actually are cannabinoid receptors that we're all born with. And those naturally occurring cannabinoid receptors are important in development, memory, cognition, appetite, immunological function, reproduction, movement, and pain, which is why some of the medical uses of it can be useful. However, I think if you're a 10th grader and your brain is still wiring up, introducing cannabis is a significant concern. So, as you probably have read from or heard about, that with neuroimaging studies, we've gotten a greater understanding of how the brain develops. In the early part of one's life, there's lots of proliferation of neurons. So you actually have millions of neurons that are formed, and then through the process of adolescence, there's a lot of pruning and more sophistication of your neurons into circuits that help us function into healthy adults. So in women, for example, the process takes until you're in your 20s. In men, it, not surprisingly, takes another 10 years, and it's about well into the mid-20s, into the 30s. But that means that there's lots of wiring and circuitry being formed, and if the impact of cannabis use is disrupting that, you end up with potential problems with emotional disorders as well as cognitive disorders. So that's why the concern is about if there's greater access, which there is, and if there's less perception or risk, and you have younger teens using it, it becomes a potential problem for that disruption in the circuitry. The other thing that is known is that the younger you use it, the greater your chances of becoming addicted, and that's based upon the fact that in that development I was talking about, the lower part of your brain, the part that seeks reward and seeks sensation, is very active and powerful. The part that helps you become an adult and the part that helps you think clearly and make the right decisions, called the prefrontal cortex, isn't as fully developed. So there's a sense that when you start and introduce a substance early, that there's a greater chance that that person will continue to use. And that's what there's been many studies that have shown that to be the case. And in terms of the research, there's definitely been evidence that impairing the prefrontal cortex development is occurring. There's impairment in how the stress hormones are being managed. There's also impairment in how dopamine, which is the reward neurochemical, is being handled as well. There's evidence that by using cannabis early, it disrupts how axons and neurons connect to each other. And that's also been shown even with recreational use. So the question is, what is the impact of using cannabis on a person's longer-term life in addition to the cognitive delay that we heard about? There does seem to be evidence that if you are using cannabis, the number of other disorders that you might also have is much greater than the general population. That, for example, in adolescents who smoke heavily, the chance of having a mood disorder is 40% higher than in individuals who aren't smoking. Similarly, with regard to psychosis, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that if you use cannabis regularly as a teenager and continue to use, your chance of having a psychotic disorder increases, and there's been several studies in longitudinal follow-up that is occurring. The psychosis that's studied is in schizophrenia, but it also can be in other psychotic disorders as well. In depression and anxiety, it's not quite as clear that if you smoke, that there's a causal relationship of increased depression long term, but it is still higher than what you'd expect. So I guess what I'd like to also echo is the fact that in the last couple of decades that there has been an increase in the potency of the cannabis that's being used. And there, I think as I mentioned about this case that was using sour diesel, that is a highly potent form, and that person, who was a fairly healthy kid, had a very substantial illness that interfered with his trajectory of life for most of the year. Fortunately, he was able to recover and went forward. There does seem to be some genetic link to which kids will have more trouble than not. It would be nice if, as we're looking at children and adolescents, to test and look for those kids who might be more at risk, to make sure we emphasize that they should avoid it at all costs. It does work sometimes once a kid has had an episode like this, they are very wary and are even able to go to college and avoid using cannabis again and have a much better outcome. Those that continue to have significant struggles. The other thing that I think is important, that is clear, that the treatments that we have for cannabis use and even for all other substances are not very good. They call that an effect size, and in the literature about treatments, there's been fairly limited success in helping kids to avoid using, and I think that's part of the brain wiring, that there's you're trying to emphasize when you're doing these treatments the prefrontal cortex. And the challenge is that the brain is focusing on the reward and sensation seeking. So trying to get kids to emphasize their adult brain when they're in the middle of adolescence is very difficult. So the hope is that by limiting the access and increasing their perception of risk, that they would use less. And I think that's the I think the mental health challenge that we have. So just in summary, I think we can, let's answer some questions if people have any, because I won't be able to sit for the panel. I think there's definitely evidence that perception of risk of cannabis is decreasing and corresponding to increased use by teens of cannabis. I don't think there's enough data yet to fully assess the impact of legalization in Washington or Colorado. I think there is good evidence that adolescents are at increased risk for addiction given their brain circuitry and wiring. Cannabis use in teens leads to change in brain structure and in functioning, including impaired cognition. I think Nora Volkow has talked about the use of cannabis being similar to what you might see with lead poisoning. You lose 8 to 10 points on your IQ. Frequent cannabis use leads to greater odds of becoming psychotic, either long-term or short-term, and I think the evidence for that is fairly compelling. And I think like I said, the treatments for cannabis dependence in teens has only had modest effects. So I think at this time if it's okay, we're going to have some questions, or okay.
What is more dangerous? Adderall, Ritalin, Clonidine, Haldol, Lexapro, and Prozac. What has more adverse effects and what causes more brain changes, psychotic episodes, suicidal ideation? Those things, or cannabis? And I'm asking you because of my 4 sons, 3 of them were diagnosed with combinations of things like ADD, ADHD, and depression. And they were given all those drugs by doctors. And then when they got to high school, they discovered cannabis, and they started to use cannabis, and it fixed all those problems for them. and they didn't need to use any of those drugs anymore, and it was non-toxic for them. And one of them was Rhode Island Scholar Athlete, got a full scholarship to WPI. One of them went to Sacred Heart and got a full scholarship on a wrestling scholarship. They became very successful using cannabis. I used cannabis all through high school. I took my SATs. I got 770 and 790. Math and verbal in math. I was accepted to MIT using cannabis. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in electrical engineering. And I think the things you're saying are false. And I think it's very harmful to our children when you lump cannabis in with all these other things like alcohol and tobacco and all these drugs like OxyContin and oxycodone. Because when you tell them that cannabis, which is safe, non-toxic, and when used properly is actually healing, not harmful, and you link all these other drugs in with them, the kids aren't going to believe you. And you tell them don't smoke cigarettes because they're the same as smoking cannabis when cannabis actually protects the lungs from lung cancer. The kids are not going to listen to you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm very pleased to hear that you have had such success with both you and your sons while using cannabis. There is a sense of a survivor effect that we think about. I think if people in the audience looked and thought of everybody who they knew who smoked pot, they would find that people who've been quite successful have smoked pot and done fine. And I think the issue is that when you look at the studies, and these are carefully done studies, that they're not perfect studies, but they are trending toward the earlier you use, the more you use of cannabis, the more structural changes in the brain is occurring. And I think that's what we're trying to be wary of. And there are, if you take 100 kids, the story of the person I mentioned, that maybe 1 out of 100 has an outcome like that. And there's going to be valedictorians who are smoking pot and moving forward. My guess is that they're not smoking, daily, and they're probably not smoking to deal with their stress, but they have other ways of being successful. But I would say that why was just one story, and I think Bradley Hospital is a unique place. I mean, we get the very ill kids, and we're seeing a lot of kids who are also on marijuana, and it is not something that you would promote as a medical profession, that we would say use cannabis for your high school kids. So.